May 1947, the United Nations General Assembly in New York. Soviet Ambassador Andrei Gromyko stood to address the assembled nations on the question of what to do with Palestine, the British-controlled territory where Arabs and Jews had been fighting for years. What he said next stunned everyone in the room. The Soviet Union, Gromyko announced, would support the creation of a Jewish state in Palestine. For the first time in Soviet history, Moscow was backing the Zionist movement it had condemned for 30 years. This was the same Joseph Stalin who had spent decades calling Zionism a tool of capitalist imperialism, the same man who would soon launch brutal campaigns against Jewish people inside the Soviet Union. Yet here was his ambassador proposing to help create Israel. Stalin would provide weapons, diplomatic support, and international recognition to save the new Jewish state from destruction. But within 5 years, the relationship would collapse into bitter hostility, and the very people Stalin had helped would become his enemy. What did Stalin expect to gain from supporting a Jewish state, and how did his gamble go so catastrophically wrong? To understand how strange this moment was, you need to know that Soviet ideology had always been against Zionism. Vladimir Lenin himself had written that Zionism was a reactionary movement that divided Jewish workers from their true class interest. For decades, the Communist Party line was clear. The idea of a separate Jewish homeland was capitalist propaganda designed to weaken the international workers' movement. Stalin himself had crushed Zionist organizations inside the Soviet Union during the 1920s and 1930s. So when Gromyko stood up in 1947 and said the Soviets might support creating a Jewish state, it represented a complete reversal of everything the Soviet Union had stood for. The decision came directly from Stalin. He overruled every single one of his foreign policy advisors who warned him this would anger Arab countries and damage Soviet influence in the Middle East. According to documents from the Soviet Foreign Ministry, Stalin's team only found out about this policy change a few days before Gromyko gave his speech. They had to scramble to rewrite all their positions practically overnight. Only Stalin had enough power to force through such a massive change in policy against unanimous opposition from his own experts. Stalin's thinking was based on two calculations. First, he wanted to push Britain out of the Middle East. The British had controlled Palestine since World War I ended, but by 1947 they were exhausted and broke. Jewish militant groups were attacking British soldiers, Arab groups were rioting, and Britain desperately wanted to leave. Stalin figured that if he supported creating a Jewish state, it would force Britain to give up and leave Palestine completely. Once Britain was gone, Stalin thought the Soviet Union could become the dominant power in the region. Second, and more important, Stalin believed Israel would become a socialist country that would side with the Soviet Union instead of the West. This wasn't a crazy idea. The Jewish community in Palestine was led mostly by socialist parties. David Ben-Gurion, who would become Israel's first prime minister, ran a Labour Party that talked constantly about building a socialist society. Another party called Mapam was even more left-wing and openly admired the Soviet Union. Many early Israeli settlements, called kibbutzim, were organized as strict communes where everyone shared everything. A lot of Israeli leaders had come from Russia and Eastern Europe, spoke Russian, and used Marxist language when they talked about politics. Stalin looked at all this and concluded that Israel would naturally want to align with the Soviet Union rather than with capitalist America and Britain. When Gromyko gave his speech, Zionist leaders couldn't believe what they were hearing. For years they had assumed the Soviets would oppose them at every turn. Suddenly, the world's second-largest superpower was offering support. Abba Eban, who later became Israel's ambassador to the UN, said the political situation went from hopeless to promising overnight. Arab communist parties were completely confused. They had spent years arguing that Zionism was a colonial project backed by Western imperialism. Now Moscow was telling them to support creating a Jewish state. Many Arab communists wrote angry letters to Soviet officials saying this policy was helping Western powers and hurting Arab liberation movements. But Stalin didn't stop with words. In January 1948, just 2 months after the UN voted to partition Palestine into Jewish and Arab states, the first weapons deal was signed. Representatives from the Jewish Agency, which was basically the pre-state Israeli government, met with Czechoslovak officials in Prague. Czechoslovakia was controlled by a communist government that had just taken power, and that government answered to Moscow. Nothing happened in Czech foreign policy without Stalin's approval. The weapons pipeline that opened up was massive. Israel bought 50,000 rifles, 6,000 machine guns, and 90 million bullets. The total cost was about $22 million, which would be roughly $250 million today. Even more critical were the aircraft. In late April and early May of the same year, contracts were signed for 25 Messerschmitt fighters. These were German planes left over from World War II that the Czechs had kept in storage. Czech military instructors trained Israeli pilots how to fly them. Later that year, Czechoslovakia sold Israel another 56 Spitfire fighters. By January 1949, about 200 Israeli specialists had been trained in Czechoslovakia, including 82 pilots who became the core of Israel's new air force. Getting these weapons from Czechoslovakia to Israel was incredibly complicated. The operation was called Balak, and it involved about 100 transport flights. The weapons couldn't be shipped directly because they had to pass through multiple countries. The route went down the Danube River through Hungary, then through Yugoslavia, then through Italy, and finally to Tel Aviv. Poland initially refused to let the weapons pass through their territory, which forced the Czechs to find other ways to get the arms to Israel. Every single step required either Soviet pressure on satellite countries or Soviet permission to use routes that violated the international arms embargo. If Stalin had wanted to stop the pipeline at any point, he could have done it with a single order. He chose not to. David Ben-Gurion said years later that the Czechoslovak weapons absolutely saved Israel. Golda Meir, who would later become prime minister, wrote in her memoirs that without these weapons, she didn't know if Israel could have survived past June of that year. The timing was critical. When Israel declared independence in May 1948, 5 Arab armies immediately invaded Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq. The new Israeli army, called the Haganah, was desperately short of weapons. The Czech rifles and machine guns arrived just in time to equip troops who were fighting for survival. The situation in those first weeks was desperate. Israeli forces had only about 22,000 fighters against combined Arab forces of over 40,000 regular troops. The Egyptian army was advancing up the coast toward Tel Aviv. The Jordanian Arab Legion, trained and led by British officers, had captured the old city of Jerusalem. Syrian forces were pushing into northern settlements. Without the Czech weapons arriving when they did, Israel's main cities might have fallen in the first month of the war. The Messerschmitt fighters proved particularly crucial. When they arrived in late May of the same year, Israeli pilots flew them almost immediately into combat despite having minimal training time. These planes became Israel's entire air force for critical weeks. In early June, Israeli Messerschmitts attacked the Egyptian column advancing toward Tel Aviv at Adhallam Junction. The psychological impact of having aircraft at all changed the entire dynamic of the battle. Egyptian forces, who had been advancing steadily with little opposition, suddenly faced air attacks and hesitated. That hesitation gave Israeli ground forces time to establish defensive positions that stopped the Egyptian advance just 25 miles from Tel Aviv. The impact of Soviet support extended beyond the battlefield. When the UN Security Council imposed an arms embargo in May of the same year, it was supposed to apply equally to all parties in the conflict. But in practice, Arab states could still obtain weapons through their established relationships with Britain and other Western powers. Egypt had British weapons and British military advisors. Jordan's Arab Legion was literally commanded by British officers and equipped entirely with British arms. Syria and Iraq had access to French and British supplies. Only Israel was completely cut off from Western sources, which made the Czech pipeline their only option for survival. What made the Czech weapons so important was that Israel couldn't buy arms from anyone else. The United States had imposed an arms embargo on the entire Middle East. Britain was still selling weapons to some Arab states, particularly Jordan, but absolutely refused to sell anything to the Jews. Israel was willing to pay almost any price for weapons. The Messerschmitt fighters cost $180,000 each, which was absurdly expensive. By comparison, Switzerland was buying superior American P-51 Mustang fighters for just $2,000 each, but Israel had no choice. Only the Soviet bloc was willing to sell them weapons, so they paid whatever was demanded. Stalin's support went beyond weapons. When the UN voted on the partition plan in November 1947, Stalin controlled 5 votes. The Soviet Union itself, plus Ukraine, Belarus, Poland, and Czechoslovakia, all 5 voted yes on partition. The resolution needed a 2/3 majority to pass. It succeeded with 33 votes in favor, 13 against, and 10 abstaining. Those 5 Soviet bloc votes represented a significant chunk of the support that got partition approved. Then in May 1948, just 3 days after Ben-Gurion declared Israeli independence, the Soviet Union became the first country to officially recognize the new state. Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov sent a telegram to Israel's provisional foreign minister saying the Soviet government believed creating a Jewish state would strengthen peace in the Middle East. This recognition came before the United States gave its official approval. President Harry Truman had supported partition, but his State Department was terrified of making Arab countries angry and losing access to their oil. When Israel declared independence on May 14th, the United States only gave what's called de facto recognition, which means they acknowledged Israel existed but didn't fully legitimize its government. The Soviet Union gave what's called de jure recognition 3 days later, which means they fully recognized Israel's government and sovereignty. This put pressure on Washington and gave Israel crucial international legitimacy at a moment when Arab states were claiming Israel had no right to exist. But even while Stalin was helping create Israel, he started attacking Jewish culture inside the Soviet Union. In January 1948, the same month the first Czech weapons deal was signed, Stalin ordered the killing of Solomon Mikkels. Mikkels was a famous Yiddish actor and director who had led the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee during World War II. That committee had been created to rally Jewish support for fighting the Nazis, but now Stalin saw it as a threat. He began shutting down Yiddish publications, closing Yiddish theaters, and arresting Jewish cultural figures. This revealed Stalin's paranoia about whether Soviet Jews could be loyal to the Soviet state if they maintained their Jewish identity. The moment that really crystallized Stalin's turn against Israel came in September 1948. Golda Meir arrived in Moscow to become Israel's first ambassador to the Soviet Union. In October of the same year, Meir visited Moscow's main synagogue for Yom Kippur, the holiest day in the Jewish calendar. What happened next shocked everyone. Tens of thousands of Soviet Jews gathered in the streets around the synagogue to greet her. Witnesses said over 50,000 people showed up, many of them shouting, Am Yisrael Chai, which means, the people of Israel live. This wasn't a small gathering or a quiet demonstration. The streets surrounding the synagogue were packed solid with people. Soviet police had to block off entire city blocks. Jewish families who had kept their identity hidden for years came out publicly to celebrate the new state of Israel. Old people wept openly. Young people sang Hebrew songs that had been forbidden for decades. Women brought their children to see the representative of the Jewish state. The crowd was so large that Meir herself could barely get through to enter the building. This massive outpouring of Jewish identification with the new state of Israel seems to have deeply alarmed Stalin. Despite decades of communist indoctrination telling Soviet citizens they should only be loyal to the Soviet state, these Jews were celebrating a foreign country with enormous passion. Stalin saw this as proof that Soviet Jews might have divided loyalties, which he viewed as a fundamental security threat. The spectacle demonstrated that no amount of Soviet propaganda could eliminate the connection Soviet Jews felt to Israel. Stalin had thought he could control this relationship, using Israel as a tool while maintaining absolute control over Soviet Jews. The synagogue demonstration showed him he was wrong. Then, in January 1949, Israel held its first real elections. The results showed Stalin that his bet on Israel wasn't going to pay off. The most pro-Soviet party, called Mapam, got only a small fraction of the vote. Ben-Gurion's Labour Party, which wanted to maintain good relations with both East and West rather than choosing sides, won the largest share. Stalin had expected gratitude for all the weapons and support to translate into political alignment. Instead, Israeli voters made it clear they weren't going to turn their country into a Soviet satellite. They appreciated Soviet help during the war, but that didn't mean they were going to side with Moscow in the Cold War. Stalin's campaign against Soviet Jews got much worse after this. In 1949, he launched attacks on what he called rootless cosmopolitans, which everyone understood was code for Jews. Jewish professors found students spying on them and going through their work looking for disloyalty. Universities stopped admitting Jewish students. Jews couldn't advance in their careers. A scientist named Olga Frydenberg described it in her diary as moral lynching. This campaign reached its peak in 1952, with what became known as the Doctors' Plot. Stalin pushed false charges, claiming that Jewish doctors were plotting to murder Soviet leaders. The accusations said that prominent doctors treating Kremlin officials, most of them Jewish, had already killed several officials and were planning to kill more. Many historians think Stalin was setting the stage for mass deportations of Jews from major Soviet cities, but he died in March 1953 before carrying out whatever he was planning. The final break between the Soviet Union and Israel came in June 1950 over the Korean War. When North Korea invaded South Korea on June 25th, the United States led a UN response to defend South Korea. Israel had to decide whether to stay neutral or support the Western position. Despite having declared a policy of neutrality earlier that year, Israel voted yes on the UN resolution condemning North Korea's invasion. Moscow saw this as definitive proof that Israel was siding with the United States. The vote was particularly significant because this was the first time in the Cold War that Soviet and American proxies were actually fighting each other. Israel's choice to back the West on this fundamental conflict destroyed whatever remaining hope Stalin had that Israel might still be drawn into the Soviet sphere of influence. After that, the Soviet Union moved decisively to cultivate Arab states instead. In 1955, the USSR began selling weapons to Egypt, marking the start of decades of Soviet support for Arab nationalism and opposition to Israel. This was a complete reversal of the 1947-1948 policy. Stalin had concluded that Israel would never serve Soviet interests and that Arab countries offered better opportunities for extending Soviet influence in the Middle East. By the time Stalin died in March 1953, the relationship was completely broken. Diplomatic relations between the Soviet Union and Israel were actually severed from February to July of that year. The journey from strong support to active hostility had taken less than 6 years. Stalin did achieve his first goal. Britain left the Middle East, giving up control of Palestine and seeing its power in the region collapse after 1948. But all the benefits went to the United States, not the Soviet Union. America became the dominant outside power through its relationships with both Israel and the Arab oil-producing states. Israel used the weapons Stalin had authorized Czechoslovakia to provide, not to build a Soviet-aligned state, but to establish an independent country that would develop one of the closest relationships with the United States of any nation in the world. Israeli leaders proved unwilling to put Soviet expectations ahead of their own national interests, despite all the crucial support they had received. Israel's strategic situation, particularly the constant security threats from neighboring Arab states, made alignment with the militarily and economically superior United States far more attractive than any relationship with the Soviet Union could ever be. Stalin's mistake shaped Soviet policy for decades. His successors, recognizing that Israel had permanently aligned with the West, committed the USSR to supporting Arab states against Israel. Throughout the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s, the Soviets provided massive military aid to Egypt, Syria, and other Arab nations. This drew the Soviet Union into regional conflicts like the 1967 Six-Day War and the 1973 Yom Kippur War. The Cold War in the Middle East became defined by this split, with the Soviets backing Arab nationalism while America backed Israel. The scale of Soviet support for Arab states eventually dwarfed what they had given Israel. Egypt alone received billions of dollars in Soviet military equipment. The Soviets sent tanks, aircraft, missiles, and entire air defense systems. They trained Arab officers in Soviet military academies. Soviet advisors served directly with Arab armies. During the 1967 Six-Day War, when Israel defeated Egyptian, Syrian, and Jordanian forces in less than a week, Israel captured massive quantities of Soviet equipment. When Egypt and Syria launched surprise attacks in the 1973 Yom Kippur War, they were using almost entirely Soviet weapons. The USSR even conducted a massive airlift to resupply Arab forces during that war, flying hundreds of missions to deliver tanks and missiles. This meant Stalin's original policy had backfired completely. The weapons he provided to Israel in 1948 helped create a strong state that became America's main ally in the region. Then the Soviets spent the next 4 decades trying to arm Arab states well enough to defeat that same Israeli military. The Czechoslovak weapons that saved Israel in 1948 were now being countered by Soviet weapons flowing to Israel's enemies. The irony was that Soviet support in both directions, first to Israel and then to Arab states, ended up costing Moscow enormous amounts of money while gaining them very little lasting influence in the region. The human cost fell on Soviet Jews. They found themselves trapped between Stalin's paranoid suspicions about their loyalty and their complete inability to leave for Israel. The campaign against so-called rootless cosmopolitans established patterns of discrimination that continued until the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet Jews who might have been able to leave during 1948 to 1950 found themselves stuck, suffering professionally and personally just for being identified as Jewish. Stalin's reversal transformed Soviet Jewish support for Israel from something that had been tolerated into evidence of treason. The irony is striking. Israel's survival during its most vulnerable period depended substantially on support from a Soviet leader who soon became deeply hostile to Jewish interests. The weapons from Czechoslovakia, the diplomatic backing at the UN, the international legitimacy that Soviet recognition provided, all of these proved essential to Israel's survival. Stalin had bet that ideology would shape Israeli policy. Instead, geography, security threat, and the relative power of the superpowers proved more important. The lesson that emerged was clear. Providing weapons and support during a crisis doesn't guarantee long-term political alignment. Israel faced an immediate threat to its existence in 1948. Soviet weapons helped them survive that threat. But once the crisis passed, Israeli leaders made decisions based on what was best for Israel's long-term security, not on gratitude for past support. The United States could offer far more military and economic aid than the Soviet Union. American weapons were better. The American economy was stronger, and crucially, the United States had no history of persecuting Jews the way the Soviet Union did. For Israeli leaders looking at their country's future, the choice to align with Washington rather than Moscow was obvious, regardless of who had helped them in 1948. This wasn't some small foreign policy experiment. Soviet foreign ministry documents show that most of Stalin's team opposed supporting partition, warning it would make Arab countries hate the USSR. Only Stalin had the power to overturn this consensus. The scale of his commitment, from Gromyko's 1947 speech through weapons authorization to diplomatic recognition, represented a huge investment of Soviet prestige and resources. The policy's total failure made it all the more embarrassing. Within 6 years, the reversal was complete. The Soviet Union went from being Israel's first diplomatic supporter and main weapons supplier to becoming its most consistent international opponent. Soviet representatives at the UN, who had argued passionately for Israel's right to exist in 1947, spent the next 4 decades blocking resolutions favorable to Israel and supporting Arab positions instead. The weapons that had flowed from Czechoslovakia to Israel in 1948 were matched by far larger quantities flowing to Egypt, Syria, and other Arab states throughout the 1950s and beyond. Stalin's successors essentially did the exact opposite of his 1947 to 1948 policy, treating Israel as an American proxy and Arab nationalism as their vehicle for influence. What began as Stalin's calculated attempt to extend Soviet power into the Middle East ended as one of his most visible foreign policy failures. He created an American ally while providing justification for decades of persecution against Soviet Jews. The episode showed the fundamental problem with using weapons and aid to buy long-term political loyalty from newly independent countries facing threats to their survival. Stalin assumed that providing weapons and diplomatic backing during Israel's founding would create lasting gratitude that would translate into Soviet influence over Israeli policy. What actually happened was that Israeli leaders accepted Soviet help during the crisis, then made their own decisions about alignment once the immediate threat to survival had passed. The very weapons that enabled Israel's independence gave it the power to choose its own partners based on national interest rather than ideological sympathy.